It's an absolute pleasure to have with us tonight Emmanuel, or Manny Botwe, as we know him, who is currently a head teacher at Tytherington School in Macclesfield. But I know Manny from his time at LMH, when I was, for a period of time, the outreach fellow. And I worked with Manny, who was our school's liaison officer. And I think you were shared with St Anne's as well at that time.
St Anne's and Somerville, I think.
And Somerville, so it was a three-way split between the former women's colleges. So our senior tutor remembers you from that time as well. And that seems like an awfully long time ago. But Manny made a very vivid impression upon me at that time. And we went on several journeys together, actually, across the country by train to visit schools far and wide. Not always successfully, actually, as we will relate. But it was a really interesting experience, and I think Manny just really made an impact on me at that stage. And then we slightly lost touch. And then I was taking my younger son to a dyslexia class in the Oxford Spars Academy, and I bumped into you randomly, actually, in the grounds outside, and I had no idea at that time that you'd moved on to teaching. And since then we've caught up, actually, and Anne and I have actually done some sessions with Tytherington School online, which has been really good, actually, and you know, just a very it's really great to be reconnected. And for me, I have to say that for me, you were unusual, because I didn't know at that time many people like yourself, actually, who were doing the kind of work that you were doing then. And I'd be really curious to know back then. So this is like 1990. It's 2000. No, it's around 2001,
Yeah.
2, something like 2002.
2002 to 4, I think.
Yeah. So, you know, I know that you'd come from a London comprehensive, South London, as your accent tells us, and that you'd gone then to Corpus to read PPE, where I think you got a first, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. So it always seemed very extraordinary to me that somebody, you know, who'd come from your background and who'd actually done brilliantly. You could have done anything that you really wanted to. You could have got into. You could have got into. Well, with a first class honours degree in PPE from that time, you could have done a lot of different things, you know, as PPEs often do. And yet you were drawn to doing outreach work, working with students, and that wasn't just a kind of temporary job. It was something that became your vocation. So I think I'd kind of like to begin, if that's okay, by asking you about your own experience of being an undergraduate at Oxford and what it was like back then for you, because we were talking about this a bit earlier. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have to say that I really enjoyed my time as an undergraduate. I think initially when I arrived at Corpus, I was extremely nervous. I remember coming up for interview, and I just remember just thinking, I have never heard accents so posh in my life. This is incredible. But you know, I remember I received an offer, and in my very first week, the porter came to know me quite well, because my mum, I'm of Ghanaian heritage, and my mum has a very strong Ghanaian accent, and she was worried about me going to university. She was like, you've got to make sure you eat well. But she'd phoned the porter after the first night to ask how I was doing, and she hadn't received a phone call. And I can remember Bob saying, you must ring your mum. She had a very strong Ghanaian accent, so I think he was really struggling to understand. She was sort of hysterical at the time, but that sort of meant that I guess there was an element of kind of, I don't know, notoriety amongst the porters, amongst staff at Corpus. But overall, I really enjoyed my time. I was JCR president.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
So I had a good time.
Did you? I mean, you said that you were one of only 2 black students in your year.
Yeah.
And how was that? I mean, we had Jasmine Richards, who you know well, actually having a similar experience when she was here, just a bit before that, late 1999, around that. So did that feel weird or what?
Yeah, I mean, it felt. I mean, I grew up in an area called Thornton Heath, which is in Croydon, and it's a heavily multicultural area. So coming up to Oxford was quite different at that time. And I remember there was another lad in my year group called Frank, actually, who was a medic, and he'd gone to, I think it was King's. He went to an independent school in London, very posh, but great guy, really great guy. And I can remember going to collect a matriculation picture, from the lodge, and I received it. I looked at it, and it wasn't me, it was Frank. And I said, this isn't me. And he was, the portrait, he went bright red. He was mortified, and I think he thought I was going. I said, look, I understand, but yeah, there was that kind of slightly odd thing that you would get. And if people were visiting the college and they were after you. People would dance around the houses in terms of their description, when they could have just said, look, the black guy with a London accent. But yeah, I mean, it was a bit, but I think I was prepared for coming up to Oxford, because at school, there was something about the school that I went to where I just felt there was a real sense of teachers saying, look, just go and grab it, just get stuck in. There had been a lad who was from my exact area, actually, probably about 7 or 8 years earlier, a guy called Rob, who I didn't know at the time, had studied PPE at Oxford. But teachers were always saying, you're like Rob, you're like Rob, you're like Rob, etc., etc. My mum adored Rob. She was like, why can't you be more like Rob? Why can't you? But so there'd always been that sense of sort of, maybe you could get a place at Oxford. So I applied and was very lucky and got a place.
It's very funny, actually. One of the questions that I've got suggested, actually, is what role models did you have?
Yeah.
Rob, obviously.
Yeah.
Rob was your role model. Yeah.
Sort of mythical Rob. Well, I never
did you
really.
ever meet him? No.
I sort of knew of him, but never really met him. But funnily enough, I did meet him when I arrived at Oxford, because he was studying for a doctorate. So I met him, and said, look, you're the mythical Rob. And he said, I know I'm Rob. But sort of said, look, even though we didn't know each other at the time, I guess that he was a real sort of trailblazer without knowing it.
It is interesting, though, that experience of sort of relative isolation. I mean, I understand that a little bit when you come from a school where there just isn't really a regular tradition, sending people. My own school was a little bit like that, but it was different in a way. But I think there was somebody who had been to Oxford mystically, about sort of 6 years earlier, and you were enjoined to follow in their footsteps. But you present this in a very comic way, and that's great. But was there anything that you felt? Did you feel insecure about it, or stressed by it, or not at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was there were all sort of things, and you never know whether or not I imagine, or I don't know that people irrespective of there'll be people from a multitude of backgrounds who will have hang-ups about going to Oxford and university, and they'll think about, what am I going to wear? I remember just being terrified about fresh dinner, genuinely really quite worried, and thinking, I'd never been to a restaurant. And my college dad, he's now an MP actually, it sort of said, you know, it's outside in. And in my mind, I was thinking outside in, outside in, outside in. So it was really kind of minor things, but I sort of thought, well, I'll work hard. You know, I can bring that to the table. I'll work hard. I'll get involved in college sport. I'm a decent football player. I think I'm reasonably okay to get along with. So I always thought that, you know, I could make friends. But yeah, there was a nervousness around kind of just being around different people. But, you know, I mean, I remember on the very first day, you know, you turn up and the JCR president is presenting to freshers about the week ahead and what Freshers Week is going to be like. And the JCR president at the time was someone called Camilla Long, who I think now writes for the Telegraph.
Golly, yeah, right. That's really interesting, yeah.
And
golly.
I just remember I'd never encountered anybody with that level of confidence. You know, I don't imagine many people have met people with that level of confidence, but I just had never, ever encountered that. You know, and that, you know, it got me to reflect back. You know, I went to, you know, it was a good school. I really enjoyed my time at school, but there was very much this sense that it was very different to schools today. There weren't many opportunities for students to kind of, you know, give speeches. You know, so I was just really struck by, you know, wow, these individuals who are so confident, who are so at home in this environment. How do you ever feel at home at Oxford? This is just, you know, there's me in my sort of shell suit. And just kind of thinking, wow, this is quite, you know, it probably took me a bit of time because you're looking around and you're sort of thinking that, you know, these are different to the individuals that I've grown up with, but, you know, in the end,
And then you decided to stand for JCR president yourself, which is interesting.
Yeah,
so you must have got used to giving speeches.
That was a year, you know, I'd been there for a year and a bit, so yeah. I'd kind of, I guess, settled into college life, and I think I ended up being the kind of a candidate, the least. It's probably one of those elections where you're seen as being the kind of centre ground candidate, really. So I don't think I won it because I was particularly charismatic or anything like that. It was, but you know, people had approached me and sort of said, yeah. The funny thing was, I'd never been to a JCR meeting before hustings, and I remember that. There was a particular candidate.
That's what I was.
There was a particular candidate who was really annoyed by this, and he'd asked a question about. The question was, you know, you need to ask the question to the candidates, you know, their attendance records, and my answer was, I've had my fair share of JCR donuts, you know, and he was furious. He hasn't answered the question, which kind of ruled himself out because, you know, he looked like he was taking this just a bit too seriously. But no, I'd never attended a JCR meeting, but a couple of people had just sort of said, look, you know, you should stand. And I thought, well, yeah, well, why not? You know. So I stood.
And how did you, just curiously, I mean, how did you find juggling all of that with your work and doing all the rest of it? Did you
well, I was a PPS, so you know, there was always that ongoing joke about PPists and sort of historians perhaps not being as having the workload that maybe your science students might have. But no, I'm the sort of person who, if I've got lots on, that almost feels like it focuses the mind. Actually, and I remember in my second year there was a comment that had been made by a tutor in you know, in an essay which basically said, look, you need to sharpen things up, and so that was, you know, I kind of realised that I'm here for the academic life, but yeah, it wasn't that much of a problem to juggle things. I mean.
So as you moved on, right? So I'd like to get to the bit where you choose to go into doing work here. Was this the first job that you did after you?
Yes, and it was. It wasn't. The plan was never to go into education.
Right.
So I was actually due to take up a job in the Home Office, and that was the plan, to return to London and work in the Home Office. And I met my now wife in the final term of university. She was at Wadham. She was a chemist. And I mean, we'd actually met a year earlier, briefly, and I don't think she liked me very much. This was when I was JCR president, and I was escorting people around the pubs of Oxford doing your JCR President Freshers Week thing, and I think I probably came across as being a bit cocky, I think. And she sort of dour northerner, and I was sort of seen as a kind of brash southerner. But we kind of met again a year later in the final term, and I thought, well, let's stick around and see what happens. So she got a job in publishing. I just saw this job and thought, well, I'll go for this job, and again was very lucky to get the job.
So the decision was based upon sort of not moving to London but staying in Oxford.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
So that was when we met.
Yeah.
So I am very interested, looking back on that time, about outreach and what we did then. I actually find it even hard to believe that I did this job. And outreach then just was different from the way that it is now. A lot of it was focused upon going out to schools physically. And of course, all of that has changed, partly because I think now we do more school visits when we've been able to colleges, and also obviously so much more in terms of online activities, and a lot of our outreach work is conducted through social media and various other channels. So I suppose I'd just be curious about what your recollections were of that time. I mean, what did you think went well, and what did you think went less well? I mean, I can think of some of the less well times very, very easily, but you were always great. I just wondered
thank you.
What you thought was good and what was less good at that time, and how we've moved on. In fact, yeah.
I think, I was always really sort of bowled over by the fact that the three colleges got together to make the appointment and gave it sufficient status that, I was able to, I was, a member of the SCR, so I had some sort of access to tutors, so it didn't feel as though it was a kind of a bolt on. It felt as though the colleges were taking it really quite seriously, and in the sort of pre-austerity times, the idea that you would be given, a sort of budget where you could go and visit schools and have children come and visit the college. I mean, I thought it was quite bold of the colleges to do so, and I think, it's difficult to kind of get a sense of the legacy, because I wasn't here long enough. So you'll know more about that than me. But I got a sense that for some of the existing undergraduates, when they were getting sort of coach loads of youngsters coming from all over the country, from non-traditional backgrounds, that in itself had an effect. When you had to have conversations with porters and the catering staff, and they were coming into the hall, and it wasn't always in the way that things were traditionally done. And I think that in itself had a bit of an effect. And every now and then I recall sort of undergraduates at the time sort of huffing and puffing about it, but then you'd hear the overwhelming majority of undergraduates at the colleges were actually really quite proud that their college was engaged in this. And I still remember, it's quite interesting because a couple of people that I can remember bringing on a school trip, there's a particular gentleman who's, he's gone on to kind of do, really impressive things actually, and I'm sure he'll do big things in politics actually. And I see him on Twitter. He's got hundreds of thousands of followers, and I can remember him coming on a trip. I think he, was either to, well, it would have been LMH Somerville, St Anne's. He got a place. He was such a keen debater. There's a lad called Lewis Ewu, who I now think runs some sort of think tank. And just so incredibly talented. And it was really through those kind of events that I increasingly began to think, well, maybe, do you know what? I think I could make a difference in schools, And I actually quite like being part of that journey and uncovering that talent. And there was a real genuine sense of satisfaction when he applied to Oxford and got his place, and has now gone on to, will do really great things. So I think to that extent, there was a real success. I think things that are different, I think at the time, there was this big focus in terms of increasing the proportion of state school students. There wasn't a great deal of talk about, sort of social background. So from a kind of, if you were looking at that as your metric, you could work out the type of schools that you could go to where you could get, a ready supply of kind of AA star students. But sometimes you kind of felt, I don't know if I'm kind of changing anything going to those type of schools, that they're going to end up at pretty good universities, they'll go on and do great things. It was working with those genuine non-traditional backgrounds where you just felt this is life-changing, and not to kind of overblow, Oxford or Cambridge in that sense. It's not the be-all and end-all. But when I go back sort of home, what's kind of struck me as I've got older is just how proud people that grew up with me on my street, who I haven't seen for years, just how proud they are that, they see it as an achievement for the street, and how they'll talk about, gee, I know somebody who went to Oxford, and, my mum, my brother and sister, they've dined out on this for, and in a way that we could get quite blasé about it, but particularly when, you sort of live in Oxford and everybody, you're around people who've been to Oxford or are currently at Oxford. But I kind of think of it, it's like winning an FA Cup medal. That's how I kind of view it. It's like, when I was growing up, I was playing the FA Cup final, and that's how I view, that's how I view it, So
it's kind of interesting because I was talking about role models, and thinking about the role models that may have inspired you, other than Rob, the famous, role model. But you must have been then a role model yourself for other people. I mean, it sounds like that. So do you know in your school actually how that worked? Was there a wave of, or even some people who then?
Yeah, I think there was always, from what I can recall of school, there was always.
So you went to a boys' school?
It was a boys' school, Catholic boys' school.
I remember this.
And we had our most successful year because me and a lad called Ben, he got in the same year as me. He went to go and read history at Magdalen, and we were both free school meal kids, which is quite extraordinary actually. I think that there'd always been that sense in the school that Oxbridge isn't. That's not the place for kind of us. And I remember seeing there was a prospectus in a classroom, and this would have been when I was in, I don't know, fourth year, what is now called year 10. I was just flicking through it. I can't remember which college, but I thought, this looks quite good. I just remember I can't remember who the teacher was, but I got a sense that he kind of felt, he kind of communicated to me that, look, this is a bit of a pipe dream. Right? And what I always kind of remind staff at school is that you have the ability to inspire, but you also have a unique, you know, you have the power to kind of humiliate, you know, and so you have to be very mindful in every interaction that you have with a child and a young person that you don't leave them feeling, you know, kind of lesser than when we first spoke to them. You know, our job is to kind of, you know, big them up. We've got to feel bigger every time, you know, after they've spoken to you. But it was a teacher called Mr. Robson who, you know, he was, you know, he was from the northeast, and he was always encouraging, you know. And he when I got into sort of year 11, and you know, I wasn't a naughty child at school, but I think I was probably that child at school that could be quite irritating for certain members of staff. I would imagine. I had a real appetite for politics, and I did a paper round, which was brilliant because you just flip through the papers, and I'd worked out at a very young age. I distinctly remember what I said to Mum. Mum would only let me stay up late if it was to watch the news. So if I wanted an extra hour awake, I'd have to watch the news, you know. So I'd watch the news. But I think sometimes that translated itself in wanting to have debates in school, probably at a time when, you know, the teacher's trying to get through the curriculum, and there's me kind of piping up about the latest news story, and also probably being quite, you know how you are when you're a teenager and you're going through a phase, and everybody goes through their communism phase, and everybody goes through that, you know, that phase where you're just trying to question absolutely everything. But he was always the teacher who would kind of nurture that and kind of say that you kind of need to find the right avenue.
It's interesting thinking about the role that teachers can play as deterrents to aspiration, as well as encouragers of aspiration. And it reminds me of one trip that you and I made. I don't know why this sticks in my memory so much, but we went by train, I think, to a comprehensive school in Northamptonshire, which was in the middle of the countryside. And it was quite strange because it was a school not unlike physically the school I attended myself, but it was in a rather bleak area, actually. It felt almost quasi-industrial, really. And I remember going in with you, and the teachers they seemed resentful of us being there. They'd managed to find a sort of gap during the lunch period when we were allowed to talk. But it really felt as though there was a sort of resistance to both the idea of going to Oxford or applying to Oxford for their sorts of students, as well as, curiously, something we talked about earlier, a contrast between perhaps a rural type of school. And when I say rural, I don't mean scenically rural. I mean actually really quite an impoverished rural area. And the resentment of a metropolitan intelligentsia, which actually wasn't around race. And in fact, almost, I sensed that they disliked you more than they disliked me, which was quite interesting. And I remember getting on the train on the way back, and we said, I think you said to me, you said, well, that didn't go too well, did it? It was one of those sorts of outings which made me think quite hard about what access was about and what sorts of tools and mechanisms, and also the idea that you could use, and also that kinds of prejudices were perhaps sort of slightly unquantifiable or fractured and complicated, more complicated, I think, than I had perhaps up to that point had realised, because you raised the point at that time that we were interested in just in some senses getting more state school students in, which I think was the target. Now our metrics are different. We look at different kinds of diversity and inclusion, and I think the whole picture has become much more nuanced, and kind of our understanding, although it's not perfect, is steadily improving. I mean, if you were to change something about that time, what would be the biggest change that you'd make, or what do you think you would do differently?
What would I do differently? It's a very good question, because I actually think you've got to remember what the times that we're in. And
no internet, really.
There's no internet. Politically, things were very different, and I actually just think making that step forward was the right thing. I think. I don't really see how else, what else you could. I thought the visits were really quite powerful. I really do, and I think people underestimate. Before I came to Oxford, Oxford was the only university I'd ever visited because we had a school trip to Oxford. Yeah. So the universities I applied for under the direction of Mr. Robson. Durham, York, Bristol, Warwick, Brunel and Oxford. And we just didn't have the, I look at some of the sixth formers now in the school I'm at, and they're all over the place. They're travelling all over the country. If you are, of sort of limited means, you don't have the opportunity to go and visit lots of these places. So I think the opportunity for youngsters to go and visit a university doesn't necessarily have to be Oxford or Cambridge, but, the nearest university, I think is really quite powerful. And I think there's a lot that the colleges can be proud of in terms of bringing those youngsters to the university. And, I was not here long enough to kind of see how many youngsters went on, came on trips and interacted at the time that ended up at university, but I bet there was probably more than you realise, and there will probably be some youngsters who ended up going to other universities that they wouldn't have gone to had it not been for some of the outreach work. And we had at the school that I'm at, we recently had a visit from I think it was some of Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, and they were very good. And a lot of what they talked about was what is life like at university, and and that's mind blowing for a lot of youngsters, and so there would be a youngster sat in the hall who would have changed the direction of their life without sounding too kind of overblown about the thing as a result of what they've heard. So I think there's lots of unquantifiable, in an age where we try to quantify everything, there are lots of unquantifiables that are out there.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you talk too about, it isn't just about Oxford and Cambridge, that it's actually about university and actually going into something beyond school, which actually for many communities actually isn't necessarily something that, because we've been doing work with the Pakistani program, which has been interesting because that again, I was talking to some guys who came over actually a couple of weekends ago, and it was really interesting thinking about the idea of that university is something that's worth doing, that you might actually want to go into further education at the age of 18, and not just leave school and go into family or do work or whatever. What's the value of education? I suppose that's sort of what we're talking about. I mean, how do you persuade people what the value of education is, even if it's not absolutely translatable into purely financial terms, such as a professional thing. PPE isn't necessarily a professional qualification. I mean, if you've done medicine or dentistry or something like that, or law even, you might think that. But
I mean, I can remember when I got my GCSE results through, my mum was surprised, and I can remember sort of thinking, if you thought about, she had this big thing about becoming a pharmacist. you know, and that's because, you know,
did that in those days,
yeah, it's like,
yeah.
look, it's a solid,
Yep.
you know, I said, look, and my A-level choices at the time, like, I chose maths, biology, chemistry. I really, you know, that wasn't my passion. And at the end of year 12, yeah, actually, I ended up, Mr. Robson kind of sort of worked this out and you know, said, look, we had an arrangement where I did the history in a year. So I dropped the maths and just did an AS qualification. He said, look, we can work it so that you will study particular topics, but I still think you should put in an application for Oxford, and we'll explain in your personal statement that, you know, basically you selected A-levels that you weren't necessarily passionate about, because I was sort of thinking, well, I don't want to go to university and study something that isn't useful. You know, can I get a job if I study politics? I don't know. You know, so, you know, and actually realise that a lot of the outreach work about going to university can dispel those things. And I guess for me, you know, what I kind of learnt from that process is, you know, you're very lucky if you can do something that you're really passionate about. You know, and if you're really passionate and you really enjoy it and you really love it, you'll do it brilliantly. And if you do it brilliantly, you know, you'll do well. You know, you'll be able to earn.
Yeah. So it's in a way the skills, no matter what.
Yeah. And I think the social aspect of university is also something that's really difficult. If you're from a family where nobody's gone to university, the social aspects, the social benefits of university are really quite hard to kind of explain and get across. You know, it doesn't sound, you know, you might think, well, you know, well, it's just difficult to get across. But actually, I think socially, the people that I interacted with, the ideas I was exposed to were huge, were massive. And I think I'm a, you know, I'm not going to say a better person, but I feel as though I've experienced a great deal more as a result of it, and wouldn't be doing what I was doing had it not been for that experience. So,
yeah. So then, right? So you do this period of time here, and is that when you decide to take up? So you were inspired then to go into teaching. I don't know why, but I kind of didn't quite expect you to make
Neither did I or Wendy, by now wife. I'd visited quite a few schools. I was just really blown away by what was happening in schools. And there was then a sort of government initiative called Fast Track Teaching.
Was that the precursor to Teach First?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So it just made teaching sound a lot more glamorous than I'd ever thought. You know, and it must have been also the time when there was, you know, I was quite into the Channel 4 teachers. There was that kind of comedy drama series that was there. But it really kind of, I'd never really thought about schools as places where you could make a difference. And it felt like there was a real moral purpose to this, and there was a real moral purpose to the programme. It was trying to encourage more sort of high calibre graduates to go into teaching and then go and work in, you know, schools where they were struggling to attract teachers. So I thought this just sounds great. And there was also a bursary that was attached to it, which meant that it felt as though, well, this is doable. So I went home one night and said to Wendy, I said, look, I want to try to become a teacher. And she was just shocked. She said, to teach what? I said, I don't quite know. I think history might be the closest thing I can do. And then trained at Norman Gordon's.
Oh, so you were there actually. That's interesting. And that was why I met you in Oxford Spires.
Yeah.
So
I went to go and work at Oxford Spires, which was a tough school at the time. It was part of what was called a National Challenge Initiative, which was, you know, there were 200 schools that were identified in the country, which I think, you know, the lowest 5A star to see at the time. But I loved it, really enjoyed it, you know, and then, you know, and then progressed career-wise. Here I am today, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because that school, one of our foundation year students, Mona Ali, was from that school actually. So and she went through
Brilliant.
English year actually, which was
Fantastic.
But I think obviously it was sometime after you left that. So then you decided, you obviously found your way into teaching and enjoyed it. But now you're a head teacher, and you're not just a head teacher. You're actually a head teacher at Tytherington School in Macclesfield. Now, we talked about this before. I mean, I know this is a sort of it seems like a curious shift, because you say that it's actually it's a North school, and it's predominantly white. Which
predominantly.
Interesting. So,
how did I end up there?
How did that happen, and how does that feel?
In my mind, I always imagined that I'd be head of a sort of multicultural school, probably in South London, near where I grew up. But you end up moving quite often for love, don't you? So my wife is originally from the northwest, which from, I guess, Preston is the closest town. And, ultimately, she always wanted to, I don't think she quite likes Southerners, actually, but she wanted to kind of move to the northwest. So when the time came, she was looking for headships in the northwest. I probably wasn't quite ready for a headship. I was fairly young at the time, but I thought, okay, well, if we're going to up sticks, I might as well throw my hat in the ring. I'd never heard of Macclesfield. I originally applied for a job in Bolton. It's a very multicultural school, but didn't get the job. Then applied for a job at another school, a school in Cheshire, didn't get the job there, but somebody on the panel had said, look, this job is coming up, next week. Really think you should apply. Went to go and visit the school, just felt incredibly warm. And so, and I think what I said to you earlier is that I'd always kind of had a reservation about, it was around fear, really, around going outside. This was initially my kind of reservation about applying to Oxford, was, where I grew up, predominantly Black and Asian, and I kind of felt, look, outside of here, how's this going to be, but then gone to Oxford, enjoyed it, and I kind of had this feeling that, look, this is my country. I can teach wherever I want, but also there's a contribution that I can make to youngsters who perhaps aren't exposed to diversity. And I don't think of myself as being a black head. I think of myself as being a head, naively or not. But it does have I was recently talking to somebody, a sort of resident. I like to do gate duty at the start of the day. And there's quite a busy road in front of the school. And it's a great duty because, you see hundreds of students coming in, say good morning. And there's a resident who sort of said, look, I've noticed that you do this all the time. But she'd also sort of mentioned that, and I kind of knew what she meant by this, although it wasn't kind of explicitly said, that it's made a difference to their town, and I'm conscious that for a lot of the youngsters, they may not have seen, a person of colour in a suit. I'm not so naive as to not think that that doesn't have an impact, but, but it does have an impact, if that makes sense, and it's, I'd read a statistic somewhere that I think there's only 50 black male head teachers in, I think it's about 3,500 secondary schools.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So wherever I'd be a head, I imagine that I'd be in a kind of tiny minority. But I hope the youngsters feel as though they've kind of benefited. But yeah, I mean, I love the school. I can't imagine being a head anywhere else.
Well, that's this is my next question, really. I mean, so I understand that you like it as a school, but I wondered, I know it's early days yet, but I always thought you'd go into politics. This is my, and clearly, you know, this idea that you're going to go into the Home Office, you know, I'm not wrong in thinking that that was there in the background, something that I hadn't known about. And I suppose I always think of you as somebody who is going to be really somebody who is a mover and shaker in the world of education. I'm not saying that you can't be as a teacher, but I just wonder, you know, in terms of impact, actually, how, you know, given all that you've done actually over the years, and, you know, and this very fast tracking actually of yourself through this process and becoming a head when you were quite young, basically. Where I know you're still quite young actually, but where would you where would you sort of see, you probably may not feel it being ahead, I would get that, you know, but where if you could make the biggest impact on educational change, where would you see that impact taking place? I mean, both perhaps a role that you might occupy or more broadly that other people would occupy. Where is it happening? Where are the differences to be made in this landscape of ours, which isn't great, I think?
You know, the aspects of, you know, look, ultimately, not ultimately, but an important, you know, if we want, look, I think in many ways we have a world-class education system. We beat ourselves up, but I think there's many things that we do in comprehensive schools that are brilliant. And I think that schools are actually significantly better than they used to be. When I think about some of the care and devotion that are given to students on a whole range of things, I just can't imagine that ever being in the conversation. But there is much work to be done, and I think that funding is a huge, huge issue. You know, when I walk into, you know, my school, there are, you know, leaking roofs, and, you know, our information technology access is not, I mean, we have, one of the things that we introduced, would have been about 4 or 5 years ago, is that the students get the opportunity to learn Mandarin. So there's roughly about 100 students in lower school who learn Mandarin. And so we have an exchange trip with the Jiangsu region, where their head teachers come and visit us. We weren't able to visit them because of COVID. The way in which they kind of look at the physical environment of our school, they are shocked. They're absolutely shocked in terms of, you know, access to computers, the physical environment. So I don't want to keep going on about money, but money is an important factor. And it you know, the thing that kind of hurts me is when you're having to make some fairly hard-nosed decisions about what I think should be basics for youngsters. I worry about leadership and recruitment and retention in the system. So we need more people to put their hands up to be head teachers and senior leaders. And, you know, when I think about the impact that I can have at this stage in my life, I think the greatest impact that I can have is being in a school. You know, it genuinely is a wonderful privilege. You have, you know, congregations, perhaps the wrong word, but, you know, you've got 1,300 youngsters, and you have a reason to have a conversation with every single one of those youngsters. You know, you've got the parents, you've got the local community. Actually, the impact that you can have is quite huge. And if I can have an influence in terms of more people feeling as though that's a career path for them to take, but also if I can talk positively about it, I know that there's a lot of people in the profession, with good reason, who will talk about the difficulties in the profession. But I guess sort of one of the benefits of having come from a sort of disadvantaged background is that you tend to just see the positives in these things, you know, and you tend to sort of think, you know, how lucky am I to be doing the job that I'm doing, you know?
And what you just said, actually, it's interesting about encouraging other people to become teachers as students. that, you know, I think for a long period of time, I know as a tutor here that I've been aware that a lot of my students wouldn't go into teaching. But I think that's changed recently. It's partly to do with COVID. I mean, I'm conscious of more students now wanting to take up teaching as a career, partly because of the fact that it seems to be a secure career, but also because of social value and the kind of social awareness that I think the deprivations caused by COVID have actually, and the inequalities which COVID has exacerbated, I think that's very much kind of brought people to the fore. In the same way that, you know, I think you also find more people becoming nurses, for example. Yeah. They want to do things that have social meaning. So I think that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, I think
so. So where do you see yourself in, say, 15 years' time?
15 years' time? How old am I now? I'm 41. So 15 years' time, knackered. Yeah. There's huge pressures at the moment with, you know, you may not be kind of following this whole debate, but, you know, academisation and multi-academisation, and I don't have an interest in being an exec head or a CEO. I just don't. I kind of think if it ever goes down that route, then I don't mean this in a flippant way, but you may as well run a kind of group of supermarkets, or, you know, do you know what I mean? It's that kind of, you know. Yeah,
you become disconnected from
And what, you know, and as a head, there is quite a bit of disconnection. You know, I don't teach a 5-period day. The way in which you interact with youngsters is different. So I'm conscious that even as a head teacher, there is a disconnect there. But I just really enjoy doing that. And I kind of think if I cease to enjoy doing that, or I think that the school just is not benefiting from me being a head, then I'll just step away. Yeah. There's still so much work to be done with the school. Yeah. You know, it's nowhere near as good as it could be. There's so much more that we could do, particularly for youngsters who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. There's a lot of unfinished work, so I don't feel as though I finished there. Yeah. You know. Yeah, no. But yeah, well, I kind of think, well, what, as far as kind of headships go, what would I want to, you know,
difficult to imagine at the moment.
Yeah, well, why would I want to?
This is a question I ask people, actually. It's not a fair question, really. Actually.
Yeah, no, but you know, I kind of think, look, just do what you're happy. You know, if you are happy doing what you're doing, this sounds really quite, you know, throwaway and cheesy, but it's genuinely not intended to be cheesy. You look at lots of people who are doing jobs that on the face of it have a great deal of kind of, you know, prestige attached to it, but they're really quite unhappy. Yeah. And I sort of think, you know, I earn fairly good money. We shop at Waitrose. You know, I live in a nice kind of village/small town. I enjoy the work that I'm doing. There isn't really a great deal more that I want in my life, if that makes sense. I feel quite
fulfilled.
Yeah, but enough of a sort of hunger to kind of think, when I'm back in school tomorrow, there's things that need to happen, and that's a good. I think you need to have that level of dissatisfaction in your life. Yeah, but other than that, I mean, it's.
Hi,
Ben.
Thanks so much for talking. So I'm Ben, and I teach English here. And as part of my duties, I also help with the admissions process for my subject. And I'm just conscious, one of the fortunate things about having you here, you know, you see those young people from the other side of that process. You know, you've done the work of inspiring them, getting their applications together, going through that process, coming back, some get offers, some don't. And I guess I was just wondering, while we've got you, is there anything that you think that we should keep in mind on the other side of that process? Is there anything that you'd like to say to me and to us as tutors that maybe we're not thinking about, or, you know, given your closeness to that process from the other side, if you see what I mean?
It's a very good question. We've we've recently appointed 2 Oxbridge coordinators to sixth form because, you know, we haven't historically had the number of successful Oxbridge applicants that I feel that a school of our profile should have. That is not exclusively about getting youngsters into Oxbridge. I think there is, you know, the enrichment that comes from that process, I think will be really great for the students who engage in that. I think if there's one thing that I would say, and I think it's very difficult for Oxford and Cambridge, is just how explicit you can be in terms of, look, you know, just be totally transparent in terms of, look, this is what you're going to need to be able to do to get a place, you know, or to stand the chance of getting a place, sorry, is a better way of thinking about it. And, you know, I think there's some times when there's some discussions about A-level selections and recommended and what's not recommended, where, you know, or what's to be expected in terms of things like the entrance, you know, admissions and things like that, where, you know, and there's a job for us to play as schools, you know, where I kind of think about a couple of candidates where I sort of think, look, there's never any guarantee of getting a place at Oxbridge. And that's one thing that you've got to kind of get across to youngsters, that, look, there's so much talent out there and there's so many people who do really well here that just don't get places. But when I get disappointed is when I think that we just haven't prepared a youngster well enough. So there's a lot of responsibility that I've just got to take on our shoulder. But I guess it's just being as explicit as possible. Demystifying. Yeah. And there's demystifying and there's demystifying, if that makes sense. And I think sometimes because, and it's difficult because, you know, this is why, you know, don't ever imagine myself in politics, because, you know, I think I'll probably end up saying the wrong thing. But, you know, I think that kind of honesty and frankness is probably something that it's really difficult for an organisation, public organisations, to do, because people will read different things into it. But I sort of think, look, we could take it on the chin, and if this is what we need to be able to if this is what we need to do for our youngsters to stand a chance, then we'll give our best shot. We'll give it our best shot. And if they don't get a place, they don't get a place. That's life. But, you know, some of the things that people don't see is there was a youngster who didn't get a place last year, which to read, you know, one of the sciences. I won't give away who it is. And I wrote to the college and I said, look, it'd be really good to kind of get some feedback. And I said, look, having been to Oxbridge myself, please don't take this as a kind of, this is the greatest student we've ever taught and they should have got a place. Like, it's genuine, you know. And what people don't see is that this tutor sent a very, very long and very honest, you know, message about why the youngster didn't get a place. It's hugely useful. He didn't have to do that. And you also sort of think in this day and age where, you know, people are out to get you, you know, or people are out to leak stories, it's incredibly open and honest, you know, and that will help youngsters in the future. Maybe not necessarily getting, you know, I would hope getting places at Oxford, but it might be at another organisation. So I think just keep engaging. As difficult as it is, try not to appear overly defensive, you know, in response, which is easier said than done. But I think there's times where I read things in the newspaper where it just feels as though there's just an over-defensiveness about it. But, you know, the people that sell Oxford and Cambridge, for me, are the fabulous youngsters that are here. And you know, as difficult as it is, I know that youngsters are, you know, the students are busy people and may not necessarily want to kind of put themselves in front of cameras or go and visit. I just kind of think getting them out into schools, or that sells the place. People will be inspired by looking at those stories, and there are more of those stories that are around. And I look around at LMH, and Christine tells me of the really strong work that's been done. Get them out. Share those stories.
Sue asks, what are common qualities you see in truly exceptional teachers?
Oh, good question. I think they have a love for young people, and I never used to use the word love in school. Maybe it's now that I have my own children that I'm increasingly kind of using that phrase. But I think, in order to be effective, an effective teacher, you have to have strong relationships with young people. And I think you need to enjoy their company. I think seeing the best in people is really important. And then there's, of course, the kind of obvious things that we'll all know: strong subject knowledge, establishing boundaries. But I think a genuine kind of, a love for young people, I think, is really important. I don't think you should go into teaching if you don't like the company of young people. And you'd be surprised how many people, not at Tytherington, I hasten to add, but you'll be surprised by number of people who sort of think, look, I don't think you like young people. Is this the right profession for you? So yeah, that would be a quality.
I wanted to ask, as a head teacher, do you ever see a lot of students this day and age not going after what they're naturally inclined to do because of pressure that is not employable? Because you mentioned that you had the same issue with your A-levels.
Yeah, so I think what often happens, particularly with youngsters from sort of non-traditional backgrounds where they don't really know how to navigate the system, you'll have only really heard of about 5 to 10 degrees, which will be things that you've learned at school, we studied at school. And so a job for us as educators is to expose youngsters to the full range of subjects that are out there. A subject like classics, I think that's a phenomenal degree. Genuinely, I think it's I think it's one of the best degree courses. How many of our youngsters have heard of that? So it's my job to kind of say, look, sometimes there's having that conversation with parents and young people to sort of say, look, if you get a classics degree from, Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol, York, Durham, that's an incredibly valuable commodity financially. So you don't have to worry about your child leaving university and ending up, not being able to get work. They will do. But yeah, I think it's a big part of the job is giving people permission to pursue things that they're passionate about. And talking about your own story, I think, can be important as well in that. Does that make sense? I realise that I ramble quite. You're getting an insight into some of my assemblies, which not often focused, overrun. Yeah.
I suppose we should wrap up now. Actually, it's been great seeing you again, Manny, and thank you so much for all your wonderful conversation. And,
thank you.
We will see you again very soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.